You think you know Dunkirk? Well, here's some things you may not have known about Christopher Nolan's latest cinematic masterpiece. Christopher Nolan first had the idea for Dunkirk nearly 25 years ago, after he and his now wife Emma Thomas joined a friend for a trip across the English Channel on a small yacht. Sailing to Dunkirk, the trio expected it to only take an afternoon. However, poor weather and cold wind meant it ended up taking 19 hours. Nolan joked that while no one was dropping bombs on them, it did plant the seeds of Dunkirk in his mind. Nolan decided to wait to make Dunkirk until he had the opportunity to do it properly to fulfill his vision. He knew that most American studios were going to be uninterested in the idea because no Americans were involved in the actual evacuation of Dunkirk. So Nolan waited until he earned enough star power and pull with studio executives as a director to make a purely British film with a large American budget. He called it, quote, "the opportunity that I've earned and the one I've taken." Dunkirk is Christopher Nolan's shortest film yet, clocking in at just 1 hour and 47 minutes, with a script of just 76 pages. By comparison, his last film, Interstellar, ran for 2 hours and 49 minutes. Dunkirk's script is about half the length of what Nolan usually writes. He described it as an entire movie that feels like the third act of another film. Unlike most of his other films, Dunkirk is driven by action rather than dialogue. This is why the script is so short. Nolan wanted the characters to be blank slates for the audience to identify with. He explained, quote, "My idea was that, instead of trying to explain through dialogue why we should care about them, we use the language of suspense. We use the language of the Hitchcock thriller to create immediate empathy with the people on screen by virtue of their physical situations." Though Dunkirk heavily relies on action to propel its plot forward, Nolan described it as deliberate and precise action. He wanted to convey how difficult a lot of seemingly simple tasks would be in a war like this, specifically calling out the example of a pilot lining up his sights with an enemy combatant, predicting their next action, and then shooting their plane down. Nolan reunited with Interstellar cinematographer Hoyt van Hoytema for Dunkirk, and Hoytema went above and beyond. For almost every sequence in the film, Nolan wanted the feeling of a handheld shot. However, many scenes also had to be shot for IMAX, the cameras for which can weigh more than 50 pounds. Hoytema had already done the unthinkable by creating a handheld IMAX camera for Interstellar. It was put to great use while filming Dunkirk, far more than in Interstellar. It took both Hoytema and an assistant to use this rig, something he described as, quote, "two grown-up men dancing the nutcracker." The IMAX cameras also presented a problem when shooting scenes inside the cockpit of Tom Hardy's Spitfire plane. The cameras were actually too big to fit inside the aircraft. Hoytema eventually rigged the camera to hang outside of the set and built a special lens that bent like a periscope. Though Warner Brothers gave Nolan the green light to make Dunkirk an R-rated film, Nolan instead opted to aim for PG-13. To do this, and to avoid alienating any of his audience, he kept out almost all traces of blood from the film, explaining, quote, "It's not the button we wanted to push." He didn't want the intensity of the film to come from graphic violence or gore, but rather from the scenarios and suspense. Though the real-world historical events at Dunkirk are inseparable from former Prime Minister Winston Churchill in the minds of many, Nolan decided to omit Churchill and most other major generals from World War II from Dunkirk. He did not want the film to, quote, "get bogged down by the politics of the situation," and instead believed that it would be much more interesting to tell the stories of the soldiers on the ground, in the sea, and in the air. The movie was filmed in the real Dunkirk in and over the English Channel. Weather was often incredibly rough, and there were intense physical demands on the film's stars. They powered through it, aware that whatever challenges they were facing were nothing compared to what the soldiers and civilians at Dunkirk experienced in the 1940s. And here's a bonus one. Though he'd heard his daughters talk about him, Nolan was actually completely unaware of how popular One Direction singer Harry Styles was before casting him in the film. He insists that Styles won the part because he auditioned well and gave the best performance. That's it for this episode of You Think You Know Movies. Make sure to subscribe, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and get the latest movie and TV news on ScreenCrush.com.